It began, as these things sometimes do in Flaxborough, not with a scream or a crash, but with a whir that abruptly became a snap, followed by a very British silence. In the middle of the dental hygiene demonstration tent at the annual Flaxborough Gala, Dr. Edwin Chubb's electric drill had juddered, stuttered, and then, quite spontaneously, thrown its head off. The chrome nozzle, liberated from its rubber tubing, sailed an elegant arc over the startled audience and embedded itself in the sponge cake that had just won second prize in the Women's Institute baking competition. Mrs. Effie Hollis, the cake's proud creator and notorious champion of pre-refrigeration preservation methods, let out a strangled squawk as the drill bit buried itself in her orange-zested glaze. She stood frozen, one gloved hand clapped to her throat as though suppressing a Victorian faint. Dr. Chubb, whose gloved fingers still hovered mid-air in a demonstration grip over a plastic molar, blinked once. "Well," he said softly, "that's not in the manual." By the time the Marquis emptied in an unspoken yet unanimous ripple of disapproval, speculation had already taken root like bindweed in the allotment. She shrieked before the thing even flew. Makes you wonder. I heard it wasn't plugged in properly. Young Beryl did the setup, and she's hopeless with wires. Mark my words, it's sabotage. Edwin's trying to sue the council over the surgery parking space. Could have hit a child, couldn't it? Might have been deliberate, like... They found teeth in the sponge, I swear it. Over in the judging pavilion, Miss Peabody of the Preserves Committee was weeping quietly into her clipboard. It was while Sergeant Love was attempting to extract the drill tip, still half embedded in the citrus sponge like some perverse Excalibur, that Inspector Purbright arrived. He came without fanfare, in his usual brown mac and a demeanor as mildly curious as a man pondering a mismatched sock. His eyes, moving with the slow grace of someone unwilling to rush conclusions, took in the splayed remains of the cake, the crowd now murmuring outside the bunting, and the expression on Dr. Chubb's face, which sat somewhere between philosophical resignation and something akin to mischief. Then he saw it. At the foot of the table, just beneath the banner, reading "Gleaming Smiles for a Glorious Flaxborough," a single white glove lay abandoned. Not the dainty sort a WI lady might wear to pass round sandwiches, but a large, rubberized one as used by dentists or forensic examiners. It was for the right hand, inside out, as though removed hastily. Purbright crouched and observed the glove without touching it. His gaze lingered on the faint brown smudge along the thumb. Tea, perhaps, or foundation cream, or blood. But he said nothing. Sergeant Love, brandishing a notepad already furrowed with confusion, emerged from behind the table. "Bit of a lucky miss. Sir, could have taken Mrs. Hollis's head clean off." "Let us be grateful for poor aim," Purbright replied. He straightened, gently nudging the glove with the tip of his shoe before slipping his hands into his pockets. Dr. Chubb approached, still wearing his smock, now speckled with remnants of the sponge. "I take it you're here for the inquest, Inspector." "I thought I'd merely observe the aftermath," said Purbright mildly. "Though I confess, this is the first case I've attended where the victim appears to be a desert." A low chuckle from somewhere near the Marquis provoked a fresh wave of outraged tuts. Purbright turned to Love. "Do you recall the winner of last year's sponge prize?" Love frowned. "Wasn't it Mrs. Haverford? She's gone off to Buxton, hasn't she?" Murmured Purbright. "It would appear someone's aiming to rise to the top this year, by unconventional means." The glove was placed discreetly in a paper evidence bag, much to the consternation of the WI ladies who muttered about spoiling the event with theatrics. By early evening, gossip had metastasized across Flaxborough's tea shops, post office queue, and barber's waiting room. Dr. Chubb was, variously, a hero, a saboteur, a fraud, and a man undergoing a bitter divorce, none of which was factually verified. At the Rose and Crown, 3 gentlemen with pints in hand debated whether dental drills were supposed to unscrew themselves under pressure or whether some bugger loosened it deliberately. Mrs. Clarice Vine, recently retired head mistress and champion of the Gala's morality stall, which sold modesty aprons and pamphlets on clean living, was heard to whisper to the vicar, "It's the Freemasons. They've been trying to discredit Dr. Chubb ever since he complained about the plaque on the war memorial." That night, as the bunting was disassembled and the sponge cake, now evidence, was placed in the council refrigerator, Purbright returned to the station and removed a folder from his drawer. Inside were several letters, all typed, all bearing the same curious footnote, which no one at the time had noticed. But Purbright had. It read, "This submission reflects the values of integrity, hygiene, and progress in Flaxborough." The same line appeared in Dr. Chubb's application to demonstrate at the gala. And, oddly, in the minutes from the last town hall debate on dental subsidies. He stared at the typeface a moment longer, then smiled faintly. At precisely that moment, back in the WI hole, Mrs. Hollis was opening the replacement sponge she had stored just in case. As she lifted the tin lid, a small slip of paper fluttered to the floor. On it was typed, "Enjoy your just desserts." By the following morning, Flaxborough was already fermenting with theories. The dental tent incident, having outpaced the expected shelf life of most village gossip, had achieved what few local stories did. It crossed the High Street divide, being discussed equally in the butcher's queue in the waiting area of Miss Fothergill's chiropody clinic. Inspector Purbright sat behind his desk in the police station, reading a copy of the Flaxborough Chronicle, which had been quick to christen the event "The Drill That Killed the Cake." The headline, regrettably, had prompted 3 letters of complaint by breakfast, 2 on moral grounds, and 1, more curiously, regarding the improper use of alliteration. Sergeant Love arrived with the investigative equivalent of a flourish, an overstuffed manila folder under his arm and a hopeful expression. "I've got the statements from everyone who was inside the tent," he declared. 14 in total, 18 if you count the ones who left early because of the dental footage. "Let us be generous and include them," said Purbright, folding the newspaper with mild reverence and placing it aside. "Any contradictions worth savoring?" "Plenty," said Love, flipping the file open. "Mrs. Trellis says she saw a shadow moving behind the display board just before the drill went off. But Mr. Crowley claims there was no one there because he was checking the extension cable and would have noticed. A clash of memories or a collision of reputations? Well, they did have that spat last winter about the hedge trimmer," Love admitted. "Might be lingering tension." "Let's mark it down as a hedge trimmer-based unreliability then," Love continued, tapping a particular statement. "And then there's Miss Beryl Entwistle. She was helping with the event setup. Says she definitely plugged the drill in properly." "Defensively?" "Firmly, capital letters and underlining. Says Dr. Chubb specifically asked her to do it because he was late finishing with a root canal and had a slight tremor in his wrist." Purbright arched an eyebrow. "Dr. Chubb's wrist tremor? Is that commonly known?" "No, sir. But apparently it's why he only takes appointments before noon these days. Or so said Mrs. Winstanley at the bakery." "A source both prolific and prone to embellishment." Love chuckled. "That's not all. Beryl said there was a second drill, a backup one, but it was missing." "A spare drill, absent at the moment of need?" Purbright leaned back slightly. "How terribly theatrical. Did anyone else confirm its existence?" "She says she saw it yesterday morning. It was in the canvas pouch with the sterilized mouth mirrors. And now, gone." For a moment, silence gathered like dust in the quiet station room. Purbright stood and walked to the window, watching as Mr. Goff, the funeral director, struggled to reverse his hearse into the chapel's side lane without scuffing the stonework. "There's a quiet pattern forming," he said. "A sabotage that's almost considerate. A drill unscrewed, not shattered. A cake ruined, but no injuries. A missing spare, but no sign of theft. Someone wanted drama, not disaster. Or they wanted attention, suggested Love. Maybe not at the dentist. Maybe from someone in the crowd? Purbright nodded slowly, then turned back. Let's have a word with Miss Entwistle, and perhaps take a gentle walk through the W.I. Hall again. They found Beryl behind the counter at Feather's Stationery, and Gifts surrounded by humming laminators and the faint perfume of potpourri sachets shaped like hedgehogs. She was tall, young, and wearing a knitted cardigan the color of mustard with a brooch shaped like a parsnip, possibly ironically. I'm not saying Dr. Chubb's a bad man, she insisted, after some pleasantries had passed. He's quite sweet, really, but there's a, shall we say, preciousness about his demonstrations. Last year he threw a paperweight at the wall when the flosser jammed. A passionate educator, Purbright murmured. He was furious the council gave him the smallest marquee, she continued. Said the jam display got more square footage than oral hygiene. Did anyone witness the drill setup apart from yourself? No, I did it alone. He was still in the surgery, and I swear I packed the backup. It was there in the pouch that morning, but when I checked again after the incident, vanished. Purbright's eyes drifted to the counter, where a stack of gala souvenir programs sat. He picked one up. Did you distribute these? We printed them here. I laid them out on all the tables myself. Curious. May I keep this? She nodded. As they left the shop, Love flipped through the program. On page 6, beneath the schedule for Maypole rehearsals and a contest titled Spot the Historic Post Box, was a tiny advert in fine serif type. Dental miracles live at 4 p.m. Witness the power of precision engineering, the future of hygiene, one drill at a time. Bit dramatic, said Love. Dramatic, agreed Purbright. And now altered. He tapped at the corner of the page. This advert was added late. The ink's different. Look here. Future is spelled with an extra E. Not in the digital file, I presume. Love looked blank. Purbright gave him a gentle smile. Time to visit the printer's records, and perhaps the council files for Chubb's application. But just before they crossed the road, a sudden shout erupted from the churchyard. A young altar boy, pale as chalk and breathless, pointed toward the hedgerow. There's another one, sir, another drill. They followed his gesture, and, nestled in the ivy at the base of the wall, lay the missing spare, its cord coiled like a serpent, and the nozzle still damp with icing. The second drill lay nestled beneath a patch of ivy that clung possessively to the outer wall of St. Ethelburga's. Its chrome surface caught the morning sun with an almost smug glint, the cord tucked neatly beside it as though someone had laid it down with the same care reserved for picnic cutlery. Sergeant Love crouched beside it, pulling on gloves with theatrical purpose, while Purbright stood a little behind, surveying the hedge with faint amusement. Well, Love announced, lifting the drill delicately, it's clean, no cracks, and it doesn't look like it was dropped or tossed. No, said Purbright, this was hidden, not discarded. A cluster of choir boys watching from the path offered silent fascination, broken only when one of them, a red-cheeked lad in an oversized cassock, whispered, I bet it's poisoned, prompting his friend to elbow him sharply. Purbright turned to them with a courteous nod. You boys saw this first? The bravest of the lot, a lad with freckles and a crooked fringe, stepped forward. Yes, sir. We were looking for conkers. Gareth saw the cord. And did you touch it? No, sir. Gareth says dentists store plague in them. An imaginative theory, said Purbright dryly. I commend the caution. With the drill safely bagged and the boys shepherded off with a reminder to keep their discoveries to pine cones in future, Purbright and Love returned to the station. The drill was placed beside its twin on the evidence table. It's odd, said Love. You'd think if someone wanted to hide it, they'd have tossed it in the river or behind the refuse bins, not gently tucked into a flower bed. Indeed, Purbright said, examining both devices. It suggests the object itself wasn't the concern, only its absence. You think someone wanted it to be noticed as missing? Or suspected as stolen? He tapped a finger against the evidence bag. The trick wasn't in the act, but in the implication. A performance staged to appear clumsy. Before Love could reply, Mrs. Teatime from the front desk popped her head round the door. "Gentlemen, there's a Councillor Higgerty asking for you. He's brought his own chair, apparently." This proved to be no exaggeration. Councillor Vincent Higgerty, a florid-faced man of municipal ambition and a remarkable fondness for portable seating, had installed himself in the interview room with a collapsible canvas chair embroidered with Flaxborough, Pride in Progress. "I won't take up much of your time," he began, already unwrapping a packet of sugarless barley sweets. "But I feel compelled to speak in the interests of public reassurance." "A commendable instinct," said Purbright as he took a seat across from him. "You see, there's been talk, rumblings, and while I'm no enemy of the free press, I believe there's a difference between local color and reputational damage, particularly where public funding is concerned." "Funding? For the dental initiative," said Higgerty, adjusting his lapel pin, which bore the emblem of a smiling molar. "The council awarded Dr. Chubb a small grant for equipment. Demonstration. A modest sum, but naturally, receipts were expected. Now, with all this fuss, missing drills, projectiles in cakes, one fears scrutiny will descend, and scrutiny is the mortal enemy of smooth governance." "I see," Purbright said gently. "And were you involved in the selection of Dr. Chubb for the grant?" "I chaired the hygiene subcommittee, yes. But it was a democratic process." "And did anyone oppose his application?" Higgerty snorted. Mrs. Glibble objected on the grounds that dentistry was too modern to be trusted. But otherwise, no. Was the application process competitive? "Well, that depends what you mean by competitive." Purbright let the silence lengthen until it became faintly uncomfortable. At last, Higgerty sighed. "Look, there were other proposals. Some of them frivolous. A bid to demonstrate the dangers of jam sugar, another to reintroduce Victorian foot baths. We chose Chubb because he seemed, how shall I put it, vaguely competent, and no one could accuse him of flamboyance." Purbright offered a small smile. "Until the sponge cake incident." "Exactly," muttered Higgerty. "He's been very vocal lately. Keeps writing letters to the paper, accusing the council of institutional indifference to molars. I do wish he'd take a sedative. Do you happen to have a copy of his grant paperwork?" "I do," said Higgerty, pulling a folded envelope from his satchel. "Here, signed by Chubb, myself, and Mrs. Sithers on the Finance Committee." The document was precise, itemized, and typed in a font identical to the one used in the gala program and Chubb's event advert. Purbright's gaze settled on the footnote. "This submission reflects the values of integrity, hygiene, and progress in Flaxborough." He said nothing, but folded the paper slowly. Back in his office, he retrieved the other samples, Chubb's application, the altered program advert, and the note found in Mrs. Hollis's cake tin. The typeface was identical, but the spacing, he now noticed, was not. The G in hygiene on the cake note drooped ever so slightly compared to the rest. And on the event flyer, the T in integrity had an awkward serif. Purbright murmured. 3 texts, one font, but different machines. Sergeant Love returned from a phone call. "Sir, you'll want to hear this. The printer's ledger confirms something odd. Chubb only ordered black and white flyers. No colored ink. But the ad in the program, the one with the spelling error, that was printed with a color bleed, just that page." "So someone tampered with the print file," Purbright said, standing slowly. "Or replaced it altogether." Love hesitated. "But why? To frame Chubb?" Purbright picked up the souvenir program again. "Not to frame him, Sergeant. To make him look foolish." Before Love could respond, the front desk bell rang sharply. A constable entered with a brown paper parcel. "Delivered by hand, sir. No return address. Just says, urgent, to Inspector Purbright." Purbright opened it slowly. Inside was a pair of white rubber gloves. And a note. "You're asking the wrong questions." Purbright turned the note over twice. The paper was stiff and cheap, a kind of greyish beige best known for wrapping ham sandwiches in train station kiosks. The handwriting, on the other hand, was careful. Not elegant, exactly. Too rigid for that, but deliberate, as if the author had traced each letter slowly. Sergeant Love leaned closer, peering at the message. "You're asking the wrong questions." He exhaled through his nose. "What does that mean?" "It means," Purbright said quietly, "someone is worried I might begin asking the right ones." The gloves were not new. Each bore faint creases at the knuckles, and the right one was slightly more yellowed at the fingertips. A dab of faded pink, possibly lipstick or strawberry jam, clung to the wrist of the left. Purbright held one delicately by the cuff. "No label inside, but these are identical to the glove we found at the scene. One could almost think—" "That someone's trying to be caught," finished Love, brow furrowing, "or trying very hard to give the impression of innocence. Either way, it's theatre again." Before Purbright could elaborate, the door opened and Constable Shrike entered with a certain nervous gravity. "Sir, there's been a situation at the town hall." "Situation?" "The notice board. Someone's altered it." 10 minutes later, Purbright and Love stood before the town hall's grand glass display board, normally reserved for Rotary Club minutes, dance class flyers, and polite notices about council compost. Today, however, someone had made an editorial decision. A fresh sheet had been inserted. It was not printed, but handwritten in oversized, looping cursive, as though done by someone pretending to be flamboyant. At the top, in red marker, Flaxborough Hygiene Initiative. The truth below were 3 bullet points. Council funds paid for 2 drills, but only one was ever intended for use. Dr. Chubb's application plagiarized a proposal from 2016. Hygiene demonstrations are a cover for something dirtier. At the bottom, a scroll, "Ask about the cancelled inspection." A small crowd had gathered, including Mrs. Glibble, 2 local dog walkers, and a man from the Gazette furiously scribbling in a notepad. "Inspection?" Love repeated, frowning. "What inspection?" Purbright's gaze didn't move from the paper. "That's what we must find out. But quietly. Too many ears here." Back at the station, they cross-referenced council agendas and event logs. After an hour and 3 cups of regrettable vending machine tea, Love found something. Here, March last year, scheduled inspection of Flaxborough dental practice, postponed due to internal staffing. Changes. He flipped the page. Then rescheduled in August, but, cancelled again. No available inspector. Twice postponed, then quietly erased, murmured Purbright. Curious, particularly for a business applying for public funds. And run by someone with a tremor, Love added. They stared at one another a moment. Neither spoke the word fraud, but it lingered in the air like disinfectant. "We'll need to speak with the former inspector," said Purbright. "Find out whether the cancellations were as innocent as they seem." Love glanced at the file. "Says here the original assigned inspector was a Miss Lydia Parkin. Retired now, lives in Lower Bragley. Then let's pay Miss Parkin a visit." Lower Bragley was not so much a village as a stubborn collection of houses that had refused to be incorporated into anywhere else. They found Miss Parkin tending to a row of begonias that appeared to have been trained to bloom in military formation. She was small, sharp-eyed, and wore gardening gloves that looked capable of performing surgery. "Dental practice inspections," she said after they introduced themselves. "I did a good many of those, all spotless on paper, most of them. And in reality, Purbright asked. She sniffed. Some were playing musical chairs with invoices. Others had more creative interpretations of sterilization. One chap thought boiling his tweezers in a kettle was sufficient. And Flaxborough. Miss Parkin paused, then straightened. I remember that one. Chubb, odd fellow, overly formal, called his waiting room a sanctuary of molar wisdom. Wanted me to make an appointment like a patient. I refused. You never inspected him? No. First time he postponed claiming a burst pipe. Second time I was reassigned. Rumor was someone on the council said he was politically delicate. I didn't ask. Politically delicate, Love echoed. What does that mean? Could be anything. Votes, donations, whispers. This town thrives on whispers, Sergeant. Back in Flaxborough, the whispers had indeed spread. The town hall notice had been taken down, but not before someone photographed it and sent it to the Chronicle. By late afternoon, the paper's second edition carried a new headline, Drillgate Deepens. Who is lying? Mrs. Teatime greeted them at the station with a stack of calls. 2 complaints about slander, one suggestion that the W.I. cake sabotage was an allegory for Brexit, and a Mr. Bannister from Environmental Health demanding to know why his staff are being dragged into dental theatrics. And on Purbright's desk, left without note or fanfare, was an envelope. Inside, a single typed page. There's more to Chubb's cake than sponge. You'll find the real recipe in the council bin room. The council bin room at the rear of the civic offices was not so much a room as a corridor that had lost the will to connect to anything more important. Lit by a flickering tube that buzzed with the tired menace of neglected public infrastructure, it smelt faintly of printer ink, damp envelopes, and forgotten resolutions. Sergeant Love wrinkled his nose as he pushed open the fire door with the heel of his shoe. Hardly the vault of secrets, sir. Purbright stepped inside behind him, his gaze already scanning the racks of stacked recycling bins and unloved filing trays. The air was heavy with that particular scent of administrative decay, the kind that lingered in carbon copy pads and unopened suggestion boxes. They found it not in a bin, as the note had promised, but resting on top of a disused council shredder. A file folder, yellowed at the edges, marked Chubb Gala Application, Original Copy. Love picked it up and opened it slowly. Inside was a neatly typed version of Chubb's submission. On the surface, no different from the one already reviewed. But beneath it, clipped at an odd angle, was a second version, a draft. The wording was nearly identical, except for the proposal title. Instead of Precision in Preventive Dentistry, this one read, Demonstration, the Psychological Effect of Apparatus Failure on Public Confidence. Love blinked. That's not a hygiene lecture. No, said Purbright, that's a social experiment. They read further. The proposal described a scenario in which a controlled disruption of expected function, such as a drill malfunction, would be used to measure the impact on audience perception. Phrases like trust rupture, symbolic contamination, and performance anxiety among authority figures stood out like weeds in a vegetable plot. Love turned the final page, which was initialed not by Chubb alone, but also, faintly and in blue ink, by someone with a looping, vaguely theatrical signature. V. Higgerty. Purbright's lips thinned. It appears Councillor Higgerty approved more than he later admitted. But why the switch? Why submit the real one, then replace it? Because public funding doesn't stretch to psychological experiments, Purbright murmured. But hygiene? That gets a budget line and bunting. They returned to the station with the folder sealed in an evidence bag. As Purbright placed it gently beside the others, Mrs. Teatime reappeared, looking rather more serious than usual. You've a visitor, Inspector, rather insistent, a Miss Geraldine Dace, from the Gazette. Send her in, please. Geraldine Dace entered like a woman who had already filed 3 drafts and didn't like any of them. Tall, with a raincoat that looked like it had seen every bus shelter in Yorkshire, she took the seat opposite Purbright without being offered one. "I'm not here to make trouble, Inspector," she began, pulling a notebook from her satchel. "But I've been handed something, and I need to know if it's real." She slid the paper across the desk. It was a photograph. A blurred but unmistakable snapshot of Chubb in the gala tent, taken moments before the drill incident. The drill is in his hand. But the nozzle is already loose, tilted just slightly away from its proper alignment. "And this," she added, pulling a second sheet from her bag, "was slipped under our office door in an envelope marked Stage Directions." It was a script, 2 pages, printed in courier font with phrases like, "Drill head detaches after 30-second delay. Mrs. Hollis positioned front right for maximum visibility. Glove to be dropped near cake table." Love's jaw slackened. It was planned. Every bit of it. Purbright remained still, his eyes scanning the page. "And the note that came with this?" "No note, just the envelope. No return address, obviously." He glanced up. "Do you believe Dr. Chubb staged the incident?" Geraldine exhaled through her nose. "I don't know. But if he didn't, someone wanted it to look like he did. I came to you because if I run this, I'll have to print the whole thing, and someone's playing this story like a fiddle." "I appreciate your discretion," Purbright said. "For now, hold it." She hesitated, then nodded and stood. "You've got about 12 hours, Inspector. After that, I'll have to publish." As the door clicked shut behind her, Love turned to Purbright. "So what are we saying, sir? Chubb staged a public farce to prove some odd point about trust, with council money, and someone's now trying to make him look like a saboteur instead." Purbright walked to the window and stared out at the high street, where a group of ladies were laughing too hard outside the bakery. "No, Sergeant, that would be a rational scheme executed by a man with a plan." He turned slowly. "But what we have here is a staged failure, an overwritten motive, 3 anonymous messages, and now a script with no author. If it were Chubb's game, why start leaking evidence against himself?" Love frowned. "Then who is doing the leaking?" Before Purbright could answer, the door burst open again. Constable Shrike looked flustered, his helmet askew. "Sir, emergency at the Floral Hall. Someone's collapsed. It's Dr. Chubb, and there's a letter clutched in his hand." By the time Purbright and Love arrived at the Floral Hall, the scene had already settled into a kind of orderly chaos. A thin semicircle of onlookers had formed outside the entrance, mostly those too well-mannered to loiter openly but too curious to walk on. The gala's bunting still hung across the iron archway, incongruously festive above the hush that had fallen over the place. Inside, Dr. Edwin Chubb lay on a collapsible chair beside a long table bearing the remains of a disassembled dental display. He was upright but pale, with beads of sweat forming on his upper lip. A local nurse, summoned from the first aid tent, was holding his wrist and making firm, efficient noises about overexertion and potassium. Chubb's left hand clutched a crumpled envelope, though his grip had slackened enough that it could be eased free with minimal resistance. Purbright took it gently, offering the nurse a quiet nod before retreating a few paces. Love stood beside him as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet, written in Chubb's own cramped, precise hand. "To whom it may concern, I did not author the script. I never approved the change to the application. I agreed to participate in a demonstration only if it promoted public awareness of dental care. I was assured by Councillor Higgerty that all alterations were procedural. I fear I've been made the face of someone else's performance. Please, someone must look at the council records for July. The truth is there, E. Chubb." "Sir," Love murmured, "if this is a confession, it's the oddest one I've seen." "It's not a confession," said Purbright quietly. "It's a deflection. He's still trying to reclaim the narrative. He looks in a state, likely induced. The timing is suspicious. They approached Chubb carefully. His breathing was shallow but regular, and his eyes flicked open as they neared. "I didn't faint," he said hoarsely. "I merely lowered my blood pressure abruptly." "Unorthodox," Purbright replied, "but certainly effective in attracting sympathy." "I was sent another envelope this morning," Chubb murmured. "Plain, no postmark. Inside was a copy of the script and a photograph of me standing next to the cake. I never authorized a photographer." "Do you still have it?" Chubb gestured vaguely toward a leather satchel resting under the table. Love retrieved it and handed it to Purbright, who opened it and found the photograph inside, identical to the one shown by Geraldine Dace. "So whoever is orchestrating this," Purbright said slowly, "is leaking to both the press and the target." "Why me?" Chubb croaked. "I'm not even popular. I hardly know anyone in town. I came here to open a practice, not headline a scandal." "Popularity has very little to do with utility," Purbright replied. "A quiet man with a faint tremor, some peculiar habits, and access to council funds is far more useful as a scapegoat than a saboteur." Chubb sagged slightly. "Then who? Who would construct this madness?" Purbright didn't answer. Instead, he looked once more at the note in his hand. "Look at the council records for July." Outside the floral hall, the gossip tide was rising again. "I heard he collapsed after being handed a bill for the sponge cake. Some say he poisoned himself out of guilt." I saw the inspector nod. "That means it's murder, doesn't it?" He was always strange. Talks to his instruments, he does. Back at the station, Purbright summoned Mrs. Teatime. "Council records for July, if you'd be so kind. Particularly minutes from committee meetings on public funds or gala planning." It took only 20 minutes. Mrs. Teatime, always precise when mildly flustered, brought in a sheaf of documents bound with a faded ribbon. "They're still using the mayor's old silk thread. Tradition, they say." Purbright sorted through them carefully. The July 7th meeting stood out. Agenda, item 11, revised gala contributions, special motion. In neat type beneath it, Councillor Higgerty proposed a reallocation of minor funds to allow increased presence of health-oriented exhibitions. Amendment passed 4-1. Dissent noted from Councillor Fairley. Love blinked. "Fairley? He's head of sanitation, isn't he?" "He is, and the only one to object." A quick phone call and a short drive later brought them to the modest bungalow of Councillor Dora Fairley, a no-nonsense woman with a blunt fringe and eyes like slate. When asked about the July motion, she didn't hesitate. Higgerty brought it in under miscellaneous funding, said it would modernize the gala's image. I asked what it meant, and he just smiled and said, "A little harmless spectacle." I didn't like the sound of it. Was there any discussion of Dr. Chubb's role? Oh, yes. Said he'd be grateful for the exposure. Said he'd agreed to be part of a performance of modernity. His words. I thought it sounded like claptrap. Anyone else present? Withers from Finance, Higgerty, me, Councillor Leake, and Miss Draper from Cultural Events. Leake and Draper. Where would their loyalties fall? Fairley snorted. Leake's loyal to whoever buys him a hot lunch, and Draper's terrified of upsetting Higgerty. Draw your own conclusions. As they returned to the car, Love muttered, "It's him, isn't it? Higgerty, or at least, he's at the center of it." Purbright didn't answer immediately. He tapped the folder against his palm. Perhaps, but he's not leaking the photographs, nor writing scripts in courier font. He looked toward the town square where bunting fluttered as if nothing had happened. "No, Sergeant. Whoever's pulling the strings is still watching, and they've not had their final act yet." Late afternoon in Flaxborough had a particular kind of light, slanted, golden, forgiving. It blurred the edges of peeling paint on shop fronts and softened the more absurd angles of its council architecture. But there was no softening the mood in the station that day. Inspector Purbright sat with his fingertips pressed together, gazing at the growing spread of papers and clues on his desk. Chubb's letter of denial, the anonymous scripts, the forged program advert, the council meeting minutes, and now the odd little note from the envelope that had accompanied the staged collapse. It was a mosaic of performance and pressure, carefully choreographed, yet pointedly imprecise. Sergeant Love hovered at the doorway, flipping through a fresh list of council staff and their committee affiliations. "Miss Draper," he said, "been with cultural events for 5 years. Former drama teacher, apparently. Left the secondary school after a difference in priorities with the headmaster." No further detail. "That could mean anything from protest poems to pyrotechnics," said Purbright. Love continued. "She's known to be close to Councillor Higgerty. Attended the same amateur dramatics group. Thespic Thursdays." "Now that," Purbright murmured, "is an uncomfortable coincidence. And here's something odd. She's also the one who designed the gala souvenir program." Purbright looked up slowly. "Then she would have had access to the file before it went to press." "And maybe the script too," Love added. "If anyone in town has courier font installed, it's someone who's directed the importance of being earnest on a church stage." They didn't summon Miss Draper to the station. That would have invited resistance. Instead, they paid a polite visit to the Flaxborough Civic Arts office, which turned out to be a converted broom cupboard on the second floor of the town hall, lined with fabric samples, dried flower arrangements, and a faint scent of theatrical dust. Miss Evelyn Draper was in her mid-50s, elegant in the way women used to describe as well turned out. She wore a silk scarf, knotted at the neck, and horn-rimmed glasses on a chain. When Purbright and Love entered, she was arranging laminated signs for the upcoming Harvest of Harmony choir showcase. "Inspector," she said warmly, "I've just been reading about your activities. Quite the week, hasn't it?" "You might say that," Purbright replied. "I understand you were involved with the design of the gala program." She smiled, setting down her label maker. "Guilty. I volunteer for most of the civic events. Easier to do it myself than wait for someone to mess up the spelling of choral." "May I ask," Purbright said casually, "whether you handled the dental demonstration listing?" Her brow furrowed. "Only the formatting. The text came in separately. Emailed from Councillor Higgerty's office, I believe. I just dropped it into the layout." "With the extra E in future?" She flushed slightly. "I corrected that before printing." "That's curious," said Purbright. "We've a physical copy that still contains the error." She hesitated. "Then someone must have substituted the file. I submitted the final version via the council server. Anyone with access could have made changes. It happens more often than you'd think." "I'm sure," Purbright said evenly. "And the photograph of Dr. Chubb at the moment the drill came loose. Do you recognize it?" Draper's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. "I've seen it. Everyone has, haven't they?" "Of course," Purbright said. "But we're interested in where it came from. There was no official photographer." She hesitated again. "Well, I know Mr. Swinney from the Gazette took a few unofficial snaps. He's always hovering at the edge of things." "Thank you," said Purbright. "One last thing. Have you ever used a typewriter?" "Certainly not," she said, half laughing. "I grew up with computers." Purbright smiled politely and turned to leave. Love, sensing a pause, gave a polite nod and followed. They were halfway down the corridor when Purbright said quietly, "She's lying. That typewriter hesitation wasn't technological. It was theatrical. She performed the denial." "But what's the motive?" Love asked. "What's the endgame here? Chubb's ruined. Higgerty's cornered. The council's a joke. What does she get out of it?" "Maybe it's not about outcome," said Purbright. "Maybe it's about spectacle, control of narrative, power in the form of whispered chaos." Back at the station, a new envelope had arrived. This one bore no name but was addressed to Geraldine Dace. It had been left at the Chronicle office and forwarded by a junior reporter. Inside was a single item, a pink ribbon. Love frowned. What's that supposed to mean? But Purbright already knew. He moved swiftly to the evidence tray, lifting the white rubber gloves again. On the wrist of the left one, faint though it was, the pink smudge now made perfect sense. Lipstick, yes, but more than that. It was the same shade Draper had worn during the committee meeting in July. Purbright said softly, "She's the author of the performance, but she's no longer directing it." Love's eyes widened. "You mean someone's turned it on her?" "Someone with access to both her materials and her methods. Someone within her own little world of civic theatre." The telephone rang. Mrs. Teatime answered, then appeared at the office door, ashen-faced. "There's been another incident," she said, "at the dress rehearsal for the Harvest of Harmony showcase. The choir's staging collapsed." "Anyone hurt?" asked Purbright. "No. But left behind," she added, voice trembling, "was a single page of script. The Harvest of Harmony rehearsal was held in the Methodist Hall, a pleasant enough space when not half-lit and cluttered with discarded hymnals and tea-urns awaiting resurrection. When Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived, the mood was solemn and quietly theatrical. A section of the folding stage had given way during the alto section's warm-up, dropping 3 of the town's most respected sopranos by 14 inches and several degrees of composure. No one was injured. Only bruised egos and a torn hem or two. But the atmosphere had thickened to a soup of speculation and fragile decorum. Geraldine Dace stood just inside the doorway, notebook in hand, lips pressed thin. She said nothing as the IOP inspectors entered, but her eyes were watchful. Miss Evelyn Draper was seated on a plastic chair at the front of the room, hands clasped in her lap, her usual composure replaced with something brittle and glassy. Love stepped carefully around the edge of the buckled stage and crouched beside the prop trunk. He reached in and lifted a sheet of paper that had been tucked between a music folder and a megaphone. He passed it wordlessly to Purbright. The page was typeset in the same courier font as before. It read, "Act through collapses metaphor. Structure fails under pressure. Audience gasps, questions safety, reconsiders trust. Character, the coordinator. Line. No, it's not supposed to fall, not yet." Beneath it was a signature, not Draper's. V.H. Love gave a low whistle. "Higgerty?" Purbright didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the hall, the array of music stands, the drooping floral arrangements, the slowly gathering hush as the choir members whispered their way through confusion. He crossed to Miss Draper. "Miss Draper," he said gently, "I think it's time we spoke plainly." She looked up at him with the tentative defiance of someone who knows the script has gone off book. "Inspector, I've been framed. I don't doubt it, but you helped construct the frame." Her mouth opened, but no words followed. She looked away, toward the spot where the stage had folded like a poor magician's prop. "It was supposed to be harmless," she said finally. "A provocation, a nudge. Something the council couldn't ignore. You and Higgerty." She nodded. "He came to me in June. Said the gala needed to modernize. That if we could show how easily public confidence could be undermined, maybe the council would start investing in better safeguards. Transparency, training, real oversight." Love muttered, "By throwing a drill at a sponge cake?" She winced. "That part wasn't my idea. I helped write the fake proposal. Typed the first few scripts, but only to show how performance can shape perception. We weren't going to actually go through with it." "But someone did." "Yes," she said, "and it wasn't me." "You printed the program." "I did, but I submitted the corrected version, the one without the extra E. What went to print was different." Purbright held out the script page. "Do you recognize the signature?" Her face paled. "That's not his." "Higgerty's?" She nodded. "He uses a looped V, yes, but his H is squared off. This is a forgery." Love gave her a sideways glance. "You're saying someone mimicked the man who mimicked democracy?" Draper ignored him. "I didn't stage this rehearsal collapse. I didn't leave that paper. Someone's using our performance to punish us, or maybe to mock it." Purbright folded the page neatly and placed it in his coat pocket. "Miss Draper, I suggest, for your own protection, you avoid any further council events until this is resolved, and perhaps refrain from script writing in the meantime." As they exited the hall, Love murmured, "So she's not the mastermind." She was the author of Act 1. Someone else rewrote Act 2, and if we're reading this right, Act 3 is just beginning. They crossed the square in silence, heading toward the Chronicle offices. If the pattern held, the next clue would already be in motion. The office was quiet, save for the clacking of keys and the smell of damp newsprint. Geraldine Dace met them in the reception with one eyebrow arched. "I assume you're here for this," she said, handing Purbright another envelope. Inside was a flyer, black and white, bold font. "Coming soon, the final extraction." Below it, a single line. "The audience will learn what happens when the truth decays beneath a crown." Purbright handed it to Love. "It's the council chamber. That's where it ends." Love blinked. "Ends? Sir, with all due respect, it sounds like it's just getting started." Purbright turned toward the civic offices, where the late afternoon sun cast long, theatrical shadows across the building's sandstone facade. "That, Sergeant," he said softly, "is precisely the problem." By morning, the flyer had begun appearing in the most inconvenient of places. One was found taped to the inside of the council chamber's lavatory door, another tucked into the hymn book at St. Ethelburga's, and 3 more had been pasted onto the community notice board just above the appeal for unwanted jigsaw puzzles. Purbright held one between his fingers as he and Love climbed the worn steps to the civic offices. "The final extraction," he murmured, reading the title again. "Theatrical, dental, and ominously political." Love nodded grimly and printed on the same cheap paper as the first note. At the reception desk, they were met by Councillor Higgerty himself, flushed and flustered, his usual oily cheer replaced with red-faced irritation. "This has gone far enough," he declared before either man could speak. "Now it's public mockery. I found one of those filthy leaflets on my car window and another in my briefcase. My briefcase, Inspector. Do you understand?" "I do," said Purbright mildly, "though I suspect the message is not strictly for you." "It's council intimidation," Higgerty snapped. "Subversion of due process. It's a culmination," Purbright interrupted gently, "of a narrative you once helped begin, and which you have now, I believe, lost control of." Higgerty's face stiffened, but he said nothing. They walked through the corridor together, past the framed photographs of former mayors and the crumbling public waterworks map that no one had updated since 1973. Outside the council chamber door, a new flyer had been slipped beneath the brass letter slot. Love picked it up. This one bore only a single phrase, in italics: "All performances require an audience. The closing act begins at noon." Inside, the chamber had been rearranged. The usual chairs were stacked to one side, and a long trestle table now occupied the center, set as though for a public announcement or a press conference. But no one had claimed ownership of the change. The clerk, when questioned, swore she'd found it that way when she arrived. At 12:05, the doors opened again, and people began to filter in, quietly, cautiously, instinctively drawn to the promise of climax. Councillors, clerks, even members of the WI. Geraldine Dace took a seat in the back with her notebook ready. Miss Draper appeared too, standing stiffly near the exit. Her scarf was absent today, replaced by a plain black blouse buttoned to the throat. Purbright stood near the window, his arms folded, watching the room fill with faces, half curious, half complicit. Then, without ceremony, the lights dimmed. A small projector, balanced carefully on the clerk's desk, clicked on. No one claimed to have set it up. No one approached to operate it. But on the white wall, a film began. Grainy footage, black and white, static flicker. The first scene showed the interior of the gala dental tent, the same demonstration that had begun the scandal. But the angle was new, from behind the display board. It showed Beryl Entwistle setting up the drill, Chubb entering late, Draper checking her watch, and then someone, off to the side, carefully loosening the nozzle of the main drill. A gloved hand, deliberate, almost reverent. The image paused there. Then the screen faded to white. Text appeared. Every lie requires timing, every truth, rehearsal. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Then another line. This was not about hygiene. Higgerty stood abruptly. Turn that off. Who is doing this? This is unlawful. This is... But the screen continued. Next came a scan of a typed document, a second version of Chubb's original proposal, annotated in 2 inks, one belonging to Draper, the other now unmistakably traced to Higgerty. Then another clip, shorter, shakier, the harvest rehearsal. The choir filing in, someone kneeling by the stage supports, a clear shot of Counselor Leek adjusting a bolt and slipping a paper beneath the prop trunk. Purbright heard the room inhale. Leek was in the back row, and he now stood frozen. But the film still wasn't finished. One last clip, a brief silent shot of the council offices at night, the main entrance, the silhouette of a person pinning flyers onto the front door. The camera slowly panned in. It was Geraldine Dace. The lights came back up. The room held stillness like a held breath. All eyes turned to Dace, who slowly lowered her notebook and stood. "Yes," she said calmly. "I leaked the documents. I shot the footage. I published the scripts. Not because I planned it, but because you all deserved it." "On whose behalf?" Purbright asked, voice quiet but firm. "No one's," she replied. "Yours. The public's. You lied, you staged, you turned policy into theater. I simply made sure there was a curtain call." Higgerty spluttered. "This is outrageous. This is treachery." "No," said Purbright. "This is revelation." He turned back toward the table where the projector still hummed. "And it's not over yet." The chamber had not truly resumed its rhythm since the projector flicked off. Even with the lights restored and the machine removed, quietly and anonymously, something in the air remained unsettled, like the dust that lingers after a curtain's final drop. Councillor Higgerty sat as if he'd been poured into his chair, his hands clasped together, fingers trembling slightly despite his forced stillness. Leek had already made a retreat of sorts, technically still in the room, but pressed so far back against the wainscoting he could have passed for part of the paneling. Miss Draper stood motionless near the coat stand, lips parted faintly, as if still waiting for her cue. Purbright hadn't spoken in several minutes. He stood at the center of it all, not like a conductor, but like a man quietly listening to the room breathe. Geraldine Dace, though no longer defiant, met every glance steadily. If she was nervous, it was buried too deep for anyone to see. Love cleared his throat beside Purbright. "Should we, do something?" Purbright nodded once. "We will." He stepped forward, tapping the edge of the table to draw the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and level, "you've just witnessed the culmination of a production staged not by actors, but by administrators. There are no costumes, but the parts have been played with conviction and misdirection." He turned slightly, allowing his gaze to settle briefly on each person before continuing. What began as a misguided attempt to provoke civic reform through performance was hijacked by someone with more private intentions. The gala drill incident, the forged flyers, the collapsing stage, these were not all authored by the same hand. They were built on top of each other, layers, subplots, a facade of chaos designed to confuse not just us, but you. He picked up the script page left at the harvest rehearsal, holding it between thumb and forefinger. The handwriting here is stylized, familiar, and not just to us. Miss Draper may have helped write the first act, but this was theater rewritten by someone off stage. His gaze shifted to Higgerty. You funded the original deception, approved the repurposed proposal. Miss Draper typeset the scripts, designed the staging. Dr. Chubb, whether willingly or through subtle coercion, played his part. But when things began to shift, when Miss Dace uncovered more than she was supposed to, that's when the sabotage began. Higgerty shook his head slowly. No, I wanted transparency. I never... But you did, Purbright said gently. You wanted theater with a moral, but someone else wanted a scandal without one. He turned now toward Geraldine. You exposed the deception, yes, but your decision to leak the evidence before alerting the authorities, was that civic duty or a desire to control the final act? Her lips tightened. I wanted the truth seen, and if people got hurt along the way... She didn't answer. Purbright stepped to the back of the room, opened a small side cabinet, and withdrew a manila folder marked Building Maintenance, Stage Equipment. He opened it, flipping to the page he had bookmarked earlier. 2 days before the harvest rehearsal, he said, this file was signed out. The keys to the stage hardware locker were borrowed by a Mr. Timothy Swinney, the Gazette's photographer, a man who was at the gala tent, at the choir rehearsal, at the council building late at night with his camera. A murmur spread like a low wind. He wanted a story, Love said quietly, and he built one. Purbright nodded. He observed the performance, then stepped behind the curtain. He mimicked the style, faked Higgerty's handwriting, printed flyers on similar paper, left evidence where it would be found, escalated the narrative just enough to make it combustible. Why? Asked Draper, her voice faint but clear. Purbright didn't turn. Because no one reads civic budgets, but everyone reads front pages. At that moment, Constable Shrike entered, holding a slip of paper. He handed it to Purbright, who read it once and passed it to Love. Timothy Swinney, arrested at print shop, in possession of council projector, claims it was a satire. Love exhaled. And there it is. Purbright turned to the room again, now quieter than a sermon's final hymn. This wasn't a crime of money, or even pride. It was a performance for attention, to feel cleverer than the systems everyone else tolerates. And in doing so, Mr. Swinney endangered reputations, public trust, and quite nearly a choir of pensioners. Higgerty sank lower into his seat. Draper stared at the floor. Geraldine Dace folded her arms, defiant but unreadable. As people began to file out, murmuring in confusion, relief, or subdued horror, Love leaned close to Purbright. Odd kind of case, sir. No real motive, no body, just a long act. Purbright smiled faintly. On the contrary, Sergeant, it had the oldest motive of all. Which is? Vanity. A week later, Flaxborough had returned to what it liked best, a state of careful, curated normalcy. The bunting was down, the marquee packed away, and the floral hall had resumed its usual duties, hosting carpet bowls on Wednesdays and a silent auction for homemade chutney on Fridays. The Chronicle, under new editorial policy, now featured a community reflection column rather than a front-page exposé. Geraldine Dace's resignation had been published without flourish, just a clipped statement about editorial differences and a new freelance contract in Lincoln. Dr. Edwin Chubb had returned to his surgery. he no longer offered public demonstrations. A small card in the waiting room now read, "Precision begins in private." He looked thinner but not broken, just slightly more aware of the weight of eyes. Councillor Higgerty retained his seat, but not his committee posts. A motion of constructive disapproval had been passed with polite unanimity. He was last seen rebranding his monthly newsletter as Vincent's Viewpoints. Miss Draper, after a discreet absence, resumed her civic duties, quietly this time and with fewer monologues during minutes. She now refused all roles in amateur dramatics, though her arrangement of choir risers for the Christmas concert was described by several as eerily precise. As for Mr. Swinney, the former photographer was released on conditional bail, with a list of restrictions that included no unsanctioned projection equipment and a temporary ban on proximity to municipal buildings. His defense, that the entire affair was an ironic commentary on structural decay, had failed to elicit much sympathy from the magistrate, who disliked irony on principle. In the quiet of the police station, Purbright sat at his desk with a cup of lukewarm tea and a crossword that refused to be helpful. Sergeant Love entered carrying a small envelope. This just came in, no return address, but it was hand-delivered. Purbright accepted it without comment and opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. It showed the gala tent once more, but from a new angle, a wider frame. In the background, watching from beneath the bunting with folded arms, was a figure, female, middle-aged, a notebook in hand. Not Geraldine. Purbright smiled faintly. Another chronicler. He placed the photo on the desk and sipped his tea. It never ends, Sergeant, even when the case does. Love frowned. You think someone else was involved? No, just watching. That's the problem with theater, Love. Once you let people realize the town itself can be a stage, you never quite get the audience to leave. Love nodded slowly. Still, glad it's over. No more drills, no more collapsing stages. Oh, I wouldn't be so sure, said Purbright. Flaxborough has a peculiar appetite for spectacle. We've simply given it indigestion for the time being. He leaned back, closing the folder on the case. The cover now read, "The Dentist's Broken Drill Concluded." Outside, rain began to mist gently against the windows, the kind of rain Flaxborough preferred. Not dramatic, not disruptive, just enough to keep people indoors and murmuring over tea. Mrs. Teatime entered with a fresh tray, her expression hopeful. "Nothing scandalous today, I trust." Purbright offered a tired smile. "Only crossword clues, and perhaps one or two ghosts in the footnotes." She placed the tray down and departed with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew that the station, like the town, was most content in a state of almost silence. Purbright opened the drawer beside him and retrieved the original flyer, the one that had first announced the final extraction. He held it up once more, then folded it in half, and then again, and placed it away for good. Love stood at the door. "You're not going to tell me who really wrote that first note, are you?" "No," Purbright said. "But if it helps, they wanted to be caught, just not too quickly." A pause. "Will they try again?" Love asked. Purbright considered. "Eventually. Vanity doesn't vanish, Sergeant. It just waits for a better audience." And with that, he returned to his crossword. The clue for 6 down read, "Public deceit, lightly staged, 6. He smiled, picked up his pen, and filled in the answer.